Good morning, GC family, man. I'm so excited to be doing this video for you guys today because it means that our group has started and we're going to be getting into the Bible together. The first book of the Bible that we're going to be studying together is the book of Habakkuk, and we're actually going to be starting in the middle of it. I know that's kind of weird, but I'm going to give you guys a general breakdown of what's happened so far in the book. So the book of Habakkuk is actually set up like a dialogue or a conversation between the prophet Habakkuk and God. And Habakkuk starts off by just kind of sharing with God and lamenting what he sees in his nation of Judah. You know, he sees injustice, division, and even the moral decay of what's going on around him. People just don't care about God's word anymore. Well, in the next couple verses and chapters, God responds to Habakkuk by saying, yeah, I see it, I see what's going on, and I'm going to judge Judah with Babylon. Well, Habakkuk responds back to God and says, okay, I get it, we're bad, we deserve judgment, we've sinned, we've turned away from God, but why Babylon? These people are way more evil than we are. You're using an extremely evil nation to judge us? That just doesn't make no sense. And so that leads us to the passage that we're going to be doing today, Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 5 through 20. And it's God's response, second response to Habakkuk. And basically what he says is, he says, yes, I know they're evil, and I won't let it slip by. Babylon will also be judged. And the way that he sets this up is by using 5 woe statements. Now, I know woe can be kind of a weird word. It could either be a band that you listen to, or a song by Drake, or a funny dance that you've done. But in the Bible, a woe statement is just basically a prophetic or utterance that basically says judgment is coming. Basically, it's like a lawyer coming up to you saying, hey, you've been served, and also the judge has already put in the verdict and you're going to jail, no ifs about it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to break up these woe statements, the 5 of them, and we're just going to read them. And we're going to talk about what they generally meant and what they mean for you and I. So let's start with the first woe statement. The first woe statement is actually a woe of greed, and it's in verses 5 through 8. So chapter 2, verses 5 through 8, and let's read that real quick. Starting at verse 5. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol. Like death, he is never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. Woe not all these that take up taunt against him, and scuffling and riddles for him, and say, woe to him who heaps up what is not his own. For how long? And loads himself with pledges. Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those who awake will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them, because you have plundered many nations. All the remnant of the peoples shall plunder you. And for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. Now, what we got to see about this first woe is that Babylon had actually built their wealth through conquering other nations and taking all their money and collecting it for themselves. So what God is saying is that Babylon will be judged in the same way. What we see later on in the future is that the nation of Persia, who was under Babylon's rule, actually rose up and conquered Babylon and took all their money. So it's kind of like a divine reversal there. But greed is actually very, very important for you and I to see, because greed is one of those sins that we typically don't notice right off the bat. I mean, if you've been a Christian for quite a while, you hear people say, man, I struggle with pornography, I struggle with lust, I struggle with stealing, I struggle with X, Y, or Z. But no one ever comes up and says, hey, I'm struggling with greed today. The Bible warns us that God's people are called to forsake greed. It's because greed ends up making you want something so much that you're willing to hurt someone else to get it. The love of money or wealth is so powerful in us at times that we're willing to hurt other people in order for us to be satisfied with it. God warns against this and says this type of sin will be judged, and God's people are called to forsake greed and live in light of what God has asked us to live. I think one question you could always ask yourself is, how am I struggling with greed today? I know there's a bunch of questions we could ask, but that is actually one of the most important questions you could ask, because greed is one of those sins that can go deep inside our hearts and never be noticed if we don't try to look for it. So that's the first woe. Let's look at the second woe. And it's the second woe of individualism. And we see it from verses 9 to 11. This is what the verses say. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You have devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life, for the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. Another thing we have to learn about the nation of Babylon is they were built on individualism. They were under the control of the nation of Syria, and they rebelled and revolted against them and ended up getting their own independence and creating for themselves a new nation. What does that sound like to you? Sounds a lot like America. It's similar to our history. We were under the rule of the British, and we revolted, and we now have our own independent sovereign nation. And at its core, individualism is not that bad of a thing, right? It's actually a good thing. America in and of itself is probably one of the most freest countries there is. As American citizens, we do have a lot of freedoms that other countries just don't have. But just like any good thing, it can also become a sin or a weakness for us. If we idolize individualism, what happens is that we end up pushing all other people aside and said, my comfort is the most important thing. And if you're not helping me reach my comfort, then you're out. God says that's a judgment. God's people are called not to not take care of themselves. I'm not saying that. Take care of yourself. Make sure you're in a healthy place mentally, physically, spiritually. But God's people are also called to put others first. You know, what's the golden rule? Do unto others as you would do to yourself. So that's one of the sins that we also must look out for is individualism. Are you idolizing comfort over loving your neighbor, over loving your fellow brother or sister in Christ? That's something we should always be on the lookout for because God will judge that sin. Well, let's look at the third woe right now. The third woe is the woe of abusive power, the abuse of power. And we see that in verses 12 through 13. Here's what it says. Woe to him who built a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire, and the nations weary themselves for nothing. One more thing about Babylon is that they built their empire on blood and war. Now, don't get me wrong, power is not a bad thing in and of itself. I mean, God talks about it. He created the universe through his authority and power. Romans 13 says that we honor our authorities in our government because why? Because the power that they've been given is ultimately from God. The authority they've been given is from God. Power can be a good thing. It can be used to help people. But once again, abuse of power can also harm people. I mean, maybe all of us in this group can relate to being a victim of someone abusing their power, whether it's at work, in your family, or sadly, maybe in church. Abuse of power is a horrible thing because God gives power to the people, to his people, to humanity, to love one another. God's people are called to really reflect in ourselves and saying, how am I abusing the authority or power I've been given in some way or form? As a married family with kids, fathers, are you abusing your power? Mothers, are you abusing your power? If you're a boss at work, are you abusing your power there? It's one of those things, once again, that we really need to look deep down in ourselves and say, man, am I doing this? It's so easy to spot it in everyone else, and it's so easy to condemn everyone else. But the question is, am I guilty of this sin? Have I abused the power that God has given me to love others and to lead them ultimately, hopefully, to see Jesus as the Good Shepherd? That's a question I hope you can reflect on for this bit. All right, let's look at the fourth woe. The fourth woe that we see is in verses 15 through 17, and it's the woe of indulgence. Here's what it says. Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk, in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. This cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beast that terrified them. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities, and all who dwell in them. One more thing you can learn about Babylon is, man, they partied hard. They knew how to party. And one of the things that the text tells us about is that they would drink pretty heavily at these parties. And the reality is that indulgence is so bad, whether it's alcohol, pornography, food. Indulgence is so bad because what it is really doing is it's creating an addictive reality in our lives. Indulging in substance abuse or other things like that basically is saying that I want to escape reality. I want to escape the pain. I want to escape all these bad things, but not to God. I don't want to run towards God. I want to escape into my own world. But the problem with that is that addiction really is a prison that is hard to escape. It's a prison that only leads us to more and more death. So the question for God's people, the questions for believers, as we are who are Christians, are believers, the question for us is, what are we using as an indulgence? It could be alcohol, it could be drugs, it could be sex, it could be something like that. Or it could even just be as simple as Netflix, video games, or a hobby or sports. Those things are not bad in themselves, they're blessings from God. But the question is, are you using it to escape? If you are, it will become an addiction one day. And we are called to forsake those things and look for hope only in God. To bring our troubles and our hardship and our broken hearts, just like Habakkuk did, bring all those things to God instead. And let Him minister to us. Let Him bring us the hope that only Him can do. Well, let's look at our last woe real quick. The last woe is seen in verses 18 through 20, and it's the woe of idols. Here's what he says. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let the earth keep silence before him. What's an idol, right? I mean, I think we use this a lot. If you've been in church for a while, people are always saying, watch out for your idols, or that's an idol. What's an idol? Well, it's not just a wooden image that you pray to. It's also anything that you would consider more valuable than God. In other words, you could even say it's something that you believe that if your life didn't have it, you would be incomplete. And if your life did have it, you're good to go. You have everything. You have significance and you have value. One of the biggest temptations as human beings, as fallen human beings, is that we tend to look for everything that God gives us in idols. We tend to look for hope, security, love, satisfaction in idols. But once again, the only thing idols are good for is to fail you. It only takes one global pandemic. It takes only one natural disaster, one breakup for you to see that the idols that you put your hope into will only fail you. God's people are called to forsake idols and serve only Him. And I really think that the bigger reason behind this is not because it's a command and God will punish us for it. Really it is because God is so much more glorious than any idol you could ever create. John Calvin says that the heart is a natural idol factory. And if you really want to see the types of idols your heart can produce, just look at your deepest emotions. Look at the most strongest reactions you have. What makes you the happiest? What makes you the saddest? What makes you the most upset? Well, the reality is no matter what idol you may find at the core of those tests, God is way better than that. As believers and fellow Christians, our call is to always reflect on what idols are in my heart. What idols are tempting me to turn away from God and give them the devotion that only God deserves? That's a question I hope you can ask yourself. And really, I think if you've been walking and reading with us in this passage, we skipped a verse. Verse 14. Let me read that to you real quick. Verse 14 says this, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea." The way Hebrew poetry works, and this is how God's speech to Habakkuk is kind of set up as like a poem, is that the most important thing in the poem is actually the middle part, not the beginning or the end. And in the middle, in the middle of all this judgment that God is giving, He gives hope. That although He's going to judge evil, one day He's also going to make all things new. His glory will fill the earth and make this broken creation what it is meant to be, holy and perfect and under this rule of God. And as believers, that's the hope we actually tie to, verse 14. Because the truth is that apart from Jesus, all the woes are for us. We deserve the woe. Our failure to meet God's standard, our sin, ultimately makes us worthy of judgment, worthy of the woe statements. But because Christ lived the life we could never live, He died the death we deserve, and He resurrected, He took our punishment. He took all those woes, and that way now we could hold on to verse 14.